Before we start, just like last part, I want to put a content warning up here. This video is going to discuss these topics which are somewhat sensitive. If that isn't your bag, that's okay. This one won't be for you. Also, I want to shout out these sources in particular which really helped for this video. Now for our feature presentation. Debbie Lee is a legend. Even back in 2004, this is true. Victoria was the best women's state team with the best women's state league, and she was the best player in both. 5 league MVP medals took pride of place in the trophy cabinet that later that year would also be joined by a premiership medal she captained a side that she formed herself too, a culmination of over a decade of hard work that hadn't been without sacrifice. She'd shirked off a more lucrative career in basketball to grow the sport that she loved, and by 2004, it wasn't in a healthy state. Whereas the WNBL had been on telly for some 11 years to this point, women's football was still practically an underground sport with only state-level leagues run entirely by volunteers. Lee tried all she could to get people talking about the game, even breaking into a footy-based reality TV show in 2002. She could have gone one step further, as VFL bylaws hadn't entirely closed off women being able to play in it, but chose not to, as that wasn't what her push was all about. Women didn't want to beat men, to be stronger than men physically. No, they wanted to be free from men, to play in their own place, a safe place where they could just go about playing the sport that they loved. Luckily, she joined the Western Bulldogs as their community development manager that year and joined forces with a woman who'd had exactly the same sentiments for 50 years. At the Bulldogs, she met Susan Alberti, a board member and successful businesswoman. Alberti herself had stopped playing football as a child because it was seen as unladylike and had nowhere to go in terms of youth development, so she had to give up the game. She met with Lee, the two got on famously, and Alberti helped fund Lee's league, keeping its head above water, the first time that such an investment had been made in women's football. Alberti continued from there, providing valuable support both through her money and through her connections to the league and code. Around the same time, another set of Victorians would be spurned by the system, changing the fundamental nature of women's football. Penny Cula-Reid was a really good junior footballer, according to one of her former teammates. She and Emily Stainer had been barred from playing under-15s footy, with friend Helen Taylor banned from the under-14s, as Victorian football banned girls from playing alongside boys above the age of 12 due to fears of physicality. The three girls took Football Victoria to a civil tribunal over sexual discrimination. The defence, somewhat unfairly, compared boys' and girls' sizes, whilst disregarding that girls in sports were naturally way more athletic than the typical smaller mean, as well as disregarding that a lot of boys simply didn't want to tackle the girls anyway, which really seemed to annoy players like Chelsea Randall, who relished the challenge of beating these supposedly bigger, burlier men. And that was down to a lack of education. When I saw female players in my leagues as a junior, I didn't want to tackle them either because I thought it would be too awkward, but if you're told before the match, just treat them like men, no problem. Bang, down you go, holding the ball. Give me the ball, please. Unfortunately, Cula-Reid and Stainer's case was dismissed. Taylor's wasn't, but as she'd already aged out of that bracket by the time the case was over, she still couldn't play. With no junior leagues, this meant that women were basically banned from playing football from the age of 12 to 17. Cula-Reid's former teammate, by the way, the one who gave startling testimony earlier, well, he only played over 100 AFL games. So yeah, this is a bunch of bullshit. Thanks to the media attention this case granted, though, Football Victoria relented, opening up an under-17s league in 2004. In addition, the regulations were changed for mixed juniors, meaning girls could play with boys to the age of 14. This increased the momentum of not necessarily women's football, but women in football. More females got their voices, well, not heard, but at least in the same building as where the important voices were. As women began to earn jobs in the AFL en masse in the mid-2000s, they found the organisation viewed women's players as untalented. In the AFL's eye, I think we were a bunch of big, butch lesbians trying to kick a football around. That's what AFL Victoria staffer Chloe Curtis recalls. Girls had precious little avenues to play the game beyond primary school. Thoughts of them playing as adults, even within the AFL, were treated with curiosity to ridicule, according to Sam Mostyn, the AFL's first female commissioner. This attitude created problems best exemplified when, in 2011, a brand manager unveiling the AFL's new male-centric Auskick branding was asked if the concept could be applied to young female footballers. He said, "What's your product? What are you trying to sell?" Women's footy was stuck in a loop. They needed a senior league. This was impossible. They had no pathways to play the game as juniors. They needed funding and attention to create those pathways. When they asked for it, investors pointed out the lack of a senior league. This was impossible. They had no pathways, and so on ad infinitum. Curtis's appointment as the second female commissioner changed attitudes. Thanks to support from now GWS big boss Dave Matthews, the AFL hired a national women's football development manager. Typically, though, at a time when the AFL were offering $100 million packages for men's football in the Gold Coast, this position started out as a one-day-per-week role. The woman who took it, though, turned it into a full-time role and was so successful that she's still with the organisation today. Jan Cooper. Cooper was a player herself as a youngster, but as with most women, had nowhere to play once she hit about 13. Upon being informed that there was indeed a very low-profile women's league in her home state of WA some 20 years later, only to find it in complete shambles, she was devastated. Too old to play, she now sought to create a platform so that other women didn't have to do what she had to do and give up the sport they loved. It was hard work, though. Apparently, and not particularly surprisingly, Demetrio didn't want a bar of her, and her WA colleagues seemed very resistant to her ideas. Stuck in the Stone Ages, they seemed concerned with the concept of the AFL robbing women of their femininity. There it is again, as if every girl was goddamn Marilyn Monroe. Ironically, the AFL male attitudes were even more outdated than some of the men of Monroe's time. Cooper had an answer for them every time, and a damn good one at that. Of course, some men complained more viscerally, and Cooper sadly realised that if she were to take action against them, it would have postponed all her good work. She and her colleagues copped sexual harassment and prejudice throughout, and were unable to do anything about it. If they raised the point, they'd just get turfed, someone else brought in, all their progress would be evaporated. She was able to break through to one person, though. Craig Starcevich. One of the bigwigs in charge of WA football development, Cooper convinced Starcevich to include some women for an under-19 skills session which had talents like Jaeger O'Meara and Stephen Canilio. They were joined by young women of the calibre of Steph Chiocci and Chelsea Randall, and the lads were suitably impressed at what these women could do. Starcevich himself became a convert to women's footy after watching them play, having been very hesitant about the idea of women's footy beforehand, and would go on to be an important figure moving forward. Penny Cula-Reid, as well as the female voices on the AFL Commission, began a wave that swept the country. Women's junior leagues began popping up all over, and the AFL even invested in a high-performance academy, likely at the behest of Cooper. This culminated in a public exhibition match on the 14th of June 2010 at a local cricket ground. A big one. Not only was this the biggest stage for a women's game in Victoria to this point, probably, but it was a watershed moment for player infrastructure. Flights, board and equipment were partially subsidised by the AFL, a first for such an initiative in the women's game. Not many people saw it being staged early in the morning, but one person did. About time you got here, Andrew. This was his introduction to Randall, Chiocci, Kirby Bentley, and of course, her. The AFL Commission decided that year to lay the groundwork for a National Women's League. This led to 3 years of not a whole lot before it was decided that an exhibition game would be played. The clubs would be Victorian legacy clubs, steeped in the history of the women's game. It would be fitting that the first such game was played between the Western Bulldogs, a team with success in the VFL's only proper attempt at women's football, and a club that was saved in large part by a woman, and St Kilda, the first women's team to be associated with a VFL side. It would be fitting, but Melbourne got roped in instead, one of a minority of Victorian AFL sides to have never fielded a women's team at all. The two clubs held drafts, and Melbourne was lucky enough to win pick one, and therefore the now established superstar in Daisy Pearce, who should have been playing in a St Kilda or Carlton team if the AFL cared about the history of women's footy at all. But anyway, that's a rant for another time. And those squads played off in 2013 to a crowd of 7,500, about the same crowd as men's teams drew in Darwin. These matches continued until 2015 when the fixture was moved to Etihad Stadium and finally broadcast on national TV, getting a TV audience significantly larger than Adelaide's shellacking of a pre-Asada ban Essendon. These matches were proof of concept that this idea could work. But 12 days before the 2015 edition at the Women in Football lunch, new AFL boss Gillan McLachlan took the mic. Normally, as Sam Lane recounts, these lunches are normally a bit of a disaster, with women being patronised, stereotyped and, worst of all, bored to death. But Big Gil dropped a bombshell. He said, and this is going to be a terrible impersonation, "The National Women's League is inevitable. In fact, it is coming. The only question is timing. There's a view that the depth of talent required will make it 2020. I'm pushing everyone to be more adventurous than that. My exit here is to implore everyone in the room, get involved, play a role, and make sure that it's more like 2017 than 2020. Alarms in the court, clutches at pearls, questions asked in Congress. This was huge. Now, cynics like me might accuse McLachlan of using women's AFL as a shield to deflect media attention from the Essendon saga, but Gillan was genuinely passionate about this idea. Cooper, of course, was a huge inspiration. Typically for the AFL, though, they'd scheduled their Black Tie Wank Fest at the same time as the Women's National Carnival, so Cooper couldn't be in the room to be celebrated. Oh dear. Gill was excited about their new project, though. In fact, too excited. Josh Vanderloo, tasked with basically creating the league, had a grim prediction about how it might pan out. Talent was shallow and scattered widely around the biggest island in the world. But if you give us time, he said, none of those things are insurmountable. The only thing left for him and his team was to go out and prove it. They had the weight of millions of women on their shoulders. If they messed up, it could mean the end of women's footy. But if they succeeded, it can turn the AFL into a completely unstoppable juggernaut. Or, in other words, insurmountable. So, thanks to our man Gill, a starting goal of 2017 was set. 12 months out from its kickoff, Josh Vanderloo, Gemma Wong and their team were stuck asking exactly what it is they were trying to do here. They'd answered questions the AFL had had earlier. Yes, they had a product now. Yes, they could sell it. But what was it? And to whom were they going to sell it? They had two overarching aims. The first was to provide females with an equal opportunity to play elite Australian football, and secondly, to increase female participation rates and general interest among women in Australian football. They set themselves 6 key goals to achieve those two aims, 6 key pillars for the new league to hit to guide it through its opening years. First and foremost, they wanted AFL but for women to be the sport of choice for female athletes. That was mainly long-term, driven by each subsequent goal, but obviously they wanted it to be the biggest women's sport in the country. They wanted women like Ash Barty and Sally Pearson to be playing for Carlton or Richmond. This meant they had to get this thing to number 1, ahead of soccer, which was absolutely dominating everything, and thanks to the Matildas, right in the middle of the public consciousness, at least where it comes to women's sports. They wanted women to be able to make a career of the game and give them the skills to have a career after footy. This was hugely ambitious, as the men's game had only become fully professional within the lifespan of its most recent recruits at the time, and even that was somewhat lucky, off the back of the whole shebang being 1 week away from bankruptcy in 1986. The establishment of role models in the public eye for young women was paramount, but this was more than being the female Buddy or Dusty. They had to actually be good people too, off the field, an example to set for aspirational young girls who would become pioneering figures in the future. Tough ask. Here, they already had a start. The public had already seen some of the stars participate in exhibition games. All they needed to do was pick the right ones and drag them out in front of cameras. They already had Daisy Pearce, they already had Abby Holmes, and of course they had Moana Hope, who had the added benefit of being distinctly recognisable
on site. This was a key pillar of this strategy, distinctly recognisable athletes who you can see and therefore associate with the AFLW at first glance.
The product had to be good. Aussie rules football is already, in my opinion, the best sport in the world, so they had a good starting point. But with a shallow talent pool scattered across the biggest island nation in the world and an extremely low level of player professionalism, this was going to take some time, and indeed it would be perhaps the greatest sticking point for the common punter going forward. The product also had to be managed well, and oh god, we're trusting the AFL with this one. You know, the organisation that at this very moment were being taken to town over the Essendon supplement saga, the Talia brothers affair, the Adam Goods racism saga, a perceived decline in game quality, and of course the dreaded spectre of Hawthorn being successful. Oh, not to mention that inside AFL House there was a veritable sexism Olympics going on, key events being gaslighting, white anting, proliferation of a boys club mentality, adultery, general workplace harassment, and of course good old offences of a sexual nature. These were the people we had to trust with making the first fully professional women's football league in the country. Jesus. And that included people on the AFLW planning committee itself, looking at you, Simon Lethlean. And finally, this massive undertaking, the likes of which had only been attempted by the A-League to minimal success so far, well, it had to turn a profit, or at the very least not lose more money than the men's game made. Suffice to say, despite the $1 billion before taxes the league don't pay anyway power of the AFL, these were some very lofty goals to set before a brick had even been laid.
They also approached the topic of feminism. Okay, this video is based enough without me, of all people, mansplaining to you lot about the heavily abridged history of feminism, so I'm really going to simplify this. Cliff notes, there's basically 4 stages. First stage, suffrage, gaining basic rights that men already had. That's where footy was at between the world wars. Second wave, new wave, post-hippie age, battle for women in the workplace and restructuring of marriage hierarchies. Third wave, now that's relevant to our story. This was all about equity, making sure men and women got the same treatment, which is how the push for all of this started. But real interesting things began happening in the early 2010s, which is where we get to fourth wave feminism, empowerment. Equality is still a feature, yes, but now women were encouraged to do their own thing and go get it, girl. I am so sorry. Anyway, what has all this got to do with footy?
Well, fittingly, it all comes down to balls. These balls, as a matter of fact. Despite my championing for mixed footy earlier, it is a fact that on average women are shorter than men, typically with smaller hands, even when comparing athletic women to non-athletic men. See women's goalkeepers for more on that, except for Lydia Williams, you are a damned hero. This is bad for ball sports that use your hands. The size 5 Sharon, oh hello there, God. You can see why I don't play footy. But the size 5 Sharon has been a part of the senior men's game since 1880, but it didn't play to the potential strengths of female players as well as a smaller ball would. So, knocked the camera there, that was smooth. So in the mantra of fourth wave feminism, it was decided to change the game so as to make it better for women rather than simply use the men's gear. The size 4 Sharon, ever so slightly smaller than the size 5, was adopted and the rules were modified overall.
This included reducing on-field player numbers to 16, increasing the size of the interchange bench, and shortening the quarter length by 25%. As marketer Gemma Wong said, this was about empowerment and getting behind it. If that meant changing the game to suit, so be it. The AFL launched an exhibition series in 2016 with the temporary representative clubs putting on shows all around the country, generating publicity for the new national series to start the next year. The AFL tendered out slots for 8 teams and 13 clubs made bids. Interestingly, Port Adelaide, who fielded one of the first women's teams in SA and who would have instantly hired a superstar whose family was intrinsically linked with the club, elected to just not bid. Reportedly, this was because their admin duties were tied up in the Jiangwan Stadium deal. That lasted 3 years, in which time said superstar won 2 league MVPs and 2 flags for their biggest rivals, because Adelaide won the licence by default, as did Brisbane and GWS.
Fremantle beat West Coast for the WA spot, about the only thing they beat them in that period, with the Victorian battle turning into a grimy basement knife fight.
Of course, Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs got automatic entry, and of course the two biggest clubs, Collingwood and Carlton, got access over the others, despite Collingwood having absolutely zero history in women's football. What are you going to do? Almost to make sure the AFL was onto a winner, a final exhibition game was scheduled for the bye before the men's finals, with the EJ Whitten game also held that weekend. The Legends game only drew about 13,000 people, whereas Teddy's home of Whitten Oval was standing room only for the women's game. Moana Hope made herself a household name with over 1 million people watching at home. As if women's football needed it more hype after that, Wong's inspired recreation of the "I'd like to see that" ad for the new AFLW league promised a new, exciting product for a new type of AFL fan, whilst also drawing interest from football purists and nerds. Yo.
And all that was great, like it really seemed to generate momentum, but that was the problem. The AFL, already an institution in over its head with the public rapidly losing confidence in its administrative abilities, had to really stick the landing with this one. Could it put on a good show in week 1 of season 1? Could it keep the momentum going if it did that? And, more importantly, could a bunch of men in suits finally see past those butch lesbian stereotypes they'd held on to for so long and create a product that acted in and served the best interests of the women playing in and watching it? And that was the key point. Men don't have as much of an understanding, if any at all, as to how women actually play football and what it takes for them to play it successfully. Because after all, to create a league of her own, you had to understand how to kick like a girl.